Most people who saw her in those years wouldn't have remembered her. Nothing about her looked dangerous, but inside the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto, where children starved in slow motion and trains screamed in the distance, she became one of the most subversive figures the Nazis ever faced, a Jewish pediatrician who kept trying to save lives in a place designed for mass death. Her name was Adina Blady-Szwajger. The regime hunted people like her for the simple crime of being Jewish. They hunted her a second time for stepping into the underground, and somehow she survived both. The building shakes first. Somewhere above them, glass shatters. Gunfire snaps like dry branches. Adina crouches between the rows of makeshift pallets. A boy clings to her sleeve so tightly she can feel his fingernails through the fabric. "Is it the bombs again?" a little girl whispers. She lies. Just thunder. Another explosion. The lamp flickers, dies, and for a heartbeat there is only darkness and the sound of children trying not to cry. Then, through the floorboards comes a different sound. Heavier. More precise. Boots. German boots. Moving in rhythm. Coming closer. A nurse grabs Adina's arm. "They're checking the buildings. If they find us down here." Adina knows exactly what happens if they find a basement full of hidden children and the doctor who refused to surrender them. She looks at the stairwell, then back at the children. "Stay together," she says. "If they ask, your patients, and I'm your doctor." As if that has ever been enough to save anyone here. One of the older boys, eyes wide, asks the question she has been silently asking herself for months. "Doctor, why didn't you run away when you still could?" Because the real answer is simple and unbearable. She stayed because they couldn't. Adina Blady was born in Warsaw in 1917 into a Polish-Jewish family that believed in books, arguments over the dinner table, and the stubborn idea that knowledge came with responsibility. As a teenager, she fell in love with medicine. The human body made sense to her in a way the world often didn't. Fevers could be measured. Wounds could be sutured. There were protocols, rules, and textbooks full of answers. She chose pediatrics because children, she thought, were the most honest patients. They cried when it hurt. They laughed when it stopped. Their bodies, given half a chance, wanted to live. When she entered medical school in Warsaw, one of only a few women in her cohort, her battles would be against measles, pneumonia, malnutrition, and poor neighborhoods. She did not imagine watching entire wards die out, bed by bed. War, of course, didn't ask for her permission. In September 1939, the German invasion tore through Poland. One day she was a medical student. The next she was standing in a hallway as wounded civilians flooded through the doors. Some ran east, some tried to disappear. Adina did neither. She took whatever shifts she could get, wrapped bandages until her fingers cramped, and pretended not to notice that every uniform in the city had changed color. Medicine did not stop because politics had gone insane. Then came the decrees. Jews out of certain professions. Jews must wear armbands. Jews must move. The city she'd grown up in shrank around her, street by street, until the word ghetto stopped sounding theoretical and became a wall, a gate, a line drawn through the map and through her life. In 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was sealed. Food rations were a joke. Typhus and tuberculosis walked freely where people could not. In this shrinking world, the Germans allowed only two major hospitals to function. One of them was the Bresson and Baumann Children's Hospital. That's where Adina went. Not because it was safe. It wasn't. Not because she thought she'd live longer there. She wouldn't. She went because that's where the children were. On her first day, she stepped into a ward where every bed was already occupied, and still there weren't enough. Legs like sticks, eyes too big and faces too thin. The smell of disinfectant barely masking poverty and infection. The head physician gave her a brief tour. Storage rooms that used to be classrooms, hallways now lined with mattresses on the floor, a pharmacy with more empty jars than full ones. "This is what we have," he told her. "You either learn to work with it, or you break." She did both. She learned to improvise, and she broke, a little, every day. Lice gave them fevers, cold gave them pneumonia. Overcrowding turned simple infections into epidemics. They boiled linens until they fell apart. They smuggled in vitamins, one bottle at a time. But the arithmetic of the ghetto was brutal. A boy named Ariel became one of her favorites. 13, too thin, eyes bright with stubbornness. He joked with her, called her the doctor who never sleeps. One day he was gone. No last-minute treatment, no dramatic rescue, just a blank bed and a line in the hospital book. Years later, Adina would remember leaving flowers for his body in the morgue because it was all she had left to give. The Germans watched the hospital, but not with compassion. They wanted statistics. How many beds? How many employable? How many hopeless cases? Officials came through in crisp uniforms, followed by boots and clipboards. They demanded lists of patients who would not recover, children who could not work, infants who consumed food without contributing labor. On paper, it was rational resource management. In reality, it was a death sentence. One evening, orders arrived. A selection would be made. Adina and the senior doctors sat around a table, face to face with the worst question medicine can ask. Who do you admit might never get better, when you know exactly what the Nazis do with the incurables? They tried to cheat the lists, inflating ages, inventing diagnoses that sounded temporarily useful, labeling some children as assistants just to keep them out of the danger column. It worked sometimes. Other times trucks arrived and patients disappeared. Each time that happened, a piece of Adina's faith in the rules of her profession died. As the months turned into years, the line between life and mercy blurred. There came a point when the hospital staff knew what deportation meant. Rumors from Treblinka and other camps had seeped through the walls. Nobody pretended it was resettlement anymore. So when the ward for infants was marked for transport, and there were no more hiding places left, some doctors made a choice that would follow them to their graves. They chose a gentler death. Adina later admitted, after decades of silence, that she had once spoon-fed medicine to certain babies, not to cure them, but to spare them the horror that was coming. She poured each dose as carefully as if she were saving them, because in her mind she was, not saving their lives, but saving them from what the Nazis had planned. She did it with hands that shook and a face that burned with shame and grief. There are no neat moral labels for what she did in that ward. There was only an impossible reality, and a young doctor with no good options left. While she fought for her patients, another war was happening in the shadows. The Polish resistance needed couriers who could move plausibly between buildings, who knew the ghetto's layout, who had a reason to knock on doors without drawing suspicion. A pediatric doctor was perfect. Adina began to carry more than medical charts. Under bandage rolls she slipped messages. Between files she hid lists of names, addresses, supply requests. Some days the paper weighed more on her conscience than the stethoscope around her neck. She learned to map danger in her head. Which streets were watched by German patrols, which guards could be distracted with conversation, which back door led not just to a courtyard, but to a contact who would risk everything for a few vials of penicillin. By day she charted children's pulses. By night she memorized resistance passwords. If she were caught, there would be no trial, no appeal. She was doubly condemned, Jew and partisan, but she kept going, because the hospital didn't survive only on bandages and broth. It survived on the faint network of people outside willing to smuggle in what the ghetto was never meant to have, hope. Not all her patients ever reached a bed. Some she found on the streets. She would go out between shifts, moving through alleys layered with garbage and ash, looking for the smallest figures, children who had lost their parents, who slept in doorways, who were slowly freezing in stairwells. Once, she persuaded a Ukrainian guard with bottles of vodka to let her pass closer to the wall, where she knew some children hid. He chatted as if nothing in the world were wrong. While they spoke, a little girl slipped into view at a window behind him. Without breaking conversation, the guard raised his rifle, fired, and continued talking as if he had merely swatted a fly. Adina didn't scream. She picked up another child nearby, one who was still breathing, and walked away, trying to hold the small body in such a way that if the guard changed his mind and fired again, his bullet would hit her instead. Medicine in the ghetto meant learning to keep walking when your heart wanted to collapse on the spot. Then came the night when everything she'd been doing almost came undone. Adina was reviewing charts by candlelight when the front doors slammed open. German voices, sharp, angry. There had been reports, contraband medicine, suspicious activities, doctors protecting unproductive Jews. The staff sprang into action. Adina had just enough time to shove a boy under the desk and kick a blanket over him before the door to her ward burst open. A German sergeant stepped inside, followed by 2 soldiers with rifles and a clipboard. He demanded to see every room, every cupboard, every bed. When he pointed at the cabinet that concealed the hiding space, Adina's vision narrowed. If he opened it, those children were gone. She stepped between him and the cabinet, her voice surprisingly calm for someone who felt her heart ricochet in her chest. "Those are isolation supplies," she said, "used for patients with lice and typhus. If you open that, you'll spread infection through your men." He hesitated. He did not fear bullets, but he feared disease. She seized the hesitation and piled on more invented symptoms, more fake protocols, more references to quarantine. Finally, with a look of disgust, the sergeant waved his men onward. They stormed into another ward instead, shouting, overturning trays, terrifying children who hadn't been able to hide. When they were gone, Adina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs almost gave out. She opened the cabinet and pulled the children out one by one. They clung to her like drowning swimmers. That night, the hospital survived by a thread. held together by one woman's ability to lie more convincingly than she'd ever told the truth. By spring 1943, the ghetto was a powder keg. Deportations had thinned the hospital wards as much as disease. For the hospital, it was the end. Shells fell closer. Buildings nearby collapsed. Bullets shattered windows in rooms that had once held storybooks and lullabies. Adina moved the remaining children to the basement, the same one from the opening of this story. When the ceiling began to crumble and the air filled with dust, she realized that staying meant dying together, buried in rubble. There was one last option, escape routes the resistance had whispered about. Holes in walls, tunnels, gaps between ruined blocks. She split the children into small groups. For each group she memorized a path, out the back door, across the courtyard, through the gap in the brick, into the cellar of another building, down into a tunnel that might, if they were lucky, lead beyond the burning zone. She went with them, again and again, moving like a ghost through smoke, holding as many tiny hands as she could. On her final run, she was separated completely. She dove behind a broken wall as German soldiers fired into the alley, her ears ringing, her clothes streaked with soot. She waited, barely breathing, until the boots passed. When she finally crawled out, the hospital behind her was gone, devoured by fire and dust. The children she had saved were somewhere out there, hidden, alive for at least one more day. The children she couldn't save stayed with her forever. After the fall of the ghetto, she escaped using forged papers. Her new identity was Christian. Her new job, nurse on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw. The city was still under occupation, still brutalized, but compared to the ghetto it felt like another planet. Patients knew her only by a false name. They saw a competent young woman in a white uniform, not realizing that she had walked out of one world and into another, carrying ghosts in her pockets. She treated whoever appeared Polish, sometimes even German, because that's what she had always done. A wound was a wound. A fever was a fever. And each time she stitched skin or cooled a brow, she felt a strange dislocation. Here, on this side of the wall, her skills were taken for granted again. There, on the other side, they had turned her into a threat. She also continued to work with the underground, less visibly now, but no less committed. Once you had decided not to look away, you couldn't go back to pretending you saw nothing. When the war finally ended and the occupiers fled or were captured, people poured into the streets, flags appeared from hiding places, songs returned to mouths that had only whispered in fear for years. Adina didn't join the celebrations. She stood by a window in a quiet ward and watched people embrace in the street below, and all she could see was the faces that were missing. No Ariels, no infants from that doomed ward, no mothers who had once grabbed her coat in hallways, begging for one more day. Freedom did not bring them back. What it did bring was a choice: leave medicine behind, or keep going. She chose to keep going. She specialized in pediatric tuberculosis. Poland after the war was full of sick, undernourished children. She spent decades fighting a different kind of slow disaster: poverty, poor housing, contamination. In clinic after clinic, she listened to new parents describe their fears and watched new children grow and heal. And every so often a child would look at her just so, or a cough would echo at the same pitch as one from the ghetto, and for a second, time folded in on itself. She never really left that hospital. For many years she kept her memories close. Some of what she had done in those years felt impossible to explain to anyone who had not been there. How do you talk about giving a lethal dose to a baby and call it compassion? How do you describe risking your life to hide a handful of children when thousands more disappeared every week? How do you confess that some days you kept working not because you believed you could win, but because you couldn't bear to stop? Eventually she began to write, not as a historian, but as a witness. Her memoir, later published as I Remember Nothing More, is a title that lies and tells the truth at the same time. She remembered plenty. She just didn't want those memories to belong only to her anymore. By writing, she turned her private anguish into public testimony. By speaking, she gave other medical workers from the ghetto permission to confront their own choices. She refused to polish the story into heroism. She told it with all its rough edges, all its unbearable dilemmas, because the point for her was never to say, "Look how brave I was." The point was to say, "Look what we were forced to become, and what some of us still chose to do anyway." So what do we do with a life like Adina Blady-Szwajger's? You can call her a hero. Many do. You can call her a victim. She certainly was. You can call her a partisan, a courier, a doctor, a survivor. All of those labels are true. None of them are enough. In the end, she was a woman in her 20s who walked into the darkest place imaginable and refused to let go of the one thing she had been trained to do: help. The Nazis tried to break that. They hunted her for being Jewish. They would have killed her for working with the underground. They destroyed her hospital, her patients, her colleagues. They failed to destroy her ability to care. After the war, every child she treated, every cough she cured, every life pulled back from the edge, became a quiet answer to the question the universe had asked her in that cellar. Why didn't you run? She didn't run, because someone had to stay. Someone had to stand between the boots on the stairs and the smallest bodies in the room. Someone had to hold their hand, even when there was nothing left to offer but presence. They hunted her for being Jewish, and for daring to act like a human being, in a world determined to erase humanity. And somehow, against all odds, she survived both.